welcome everyone to this year's annual meeting of our AIS SIG DSPE, right, which is Digital Sourcing Platforms and Ecosystems. So we are now starting with the award ceremony.
The Outstanding Leadership Award is our most prestigious award. And this year we decided we had a particularly difficult time to give this award to one scholar. So we decided to award it to two exceptional scholars. Dr. Leslie Willcocks, Professor Emeritus at LSE, Professor for Technology and Globalization, and Mary Lacity, the Glass Chair and Distinguished Professor at the University of Arkansas.
Thank you very much. Both Mary and I experienced this as a great honor because it's from our peers, and that means much more than any other kind of award, really.
And I'm very grateful that, Leslie, that you agreed to give a keynote to our community, sharing your reflections on your research journey. So, Leslie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, Mary helped to design this presentation, so many thanks for the honor. I'll give you some feel for where we're coming from. I think that's useful because it is a particular angle on outsourcing and sourcing. Essentially, we decided very early on that we wanted to inform practice as well as do academic papers, partly because I spent 8 years in IT projects, and Mary worked for a consultancy for a while before she took up a PhD at Houston. So we've always been focused, we decided, on emerging practices and technologies. At the same time, we wanted to be impartial. We wanted to give evidence-based, academically robust findings to everything that we did, which was quite a radical thing to do for practitioners because, as you know, they get a lot of stuff from vendors, consultants, believe the media a lot. So we thought we were a useful counterpunch. So the idea was to do good academic work, get credit for that, but also to improve practice because it always needed improving. And the idea we had was to stay 9 months ahead of the best practitioners. How do you do that as academics? Well, you talk a hell of a lot to very good practitioners and you synthesize what they've told you and you develop through serious thinking models, frameworks, action principles is the phrase that we lit upon eventually. And we really were doing the action principles approach, which we published seriously in 2021, but we were really doing that right from the beginning. And as you can see, this is Outsourcing World Summit 2016. We're both on stage. We always were asked to present together, interestingly, unless we were continents apart. And I'm not sure why that is. I think they wanted my brain, and her presentation skills, to be honest. But she's such an excellent presenter. I think I mean, I'm quite good, but you know what I mean. There is outstanding as well. And she is quite outstanding. She used to have those audiences in the middle of her hands, you know, most of the time. So what we decided upon was we felt that in the 1990s, you know, that things got published far too late for their topicality. In fact, we thought of designing a new journal called the Journal of Ancient Information Systems Practices, where we could put all our papers after 5 years of review could be published. We decided that what we were really interested in was emerging practices. We thought that information systems academics should really be looking at this area of new technologies, new emerging practices, and how you manage them, because people find it massively difficult when they're confronted with a new technology. And it's the same with AI. There's this AI pause at the moment because people don't know what to do with it. Essentially, when you go into businesses, they don't really have much of a clue. That was the same with outsourcing initially. So that's why we gained so much momentum early on, and they were interested in talking to us. So we investigate innovators and early adopters and create action principles, things that seem to work in certain contexts. It's not best practices, things that will work in certain contexts. And The result is we very often talk to some very, very smart people, very smart practitioners. And that enabled us to produce some very robust findings, I think, and both academically, but also for practitioners. So this is the major slide. I wanted to talk through the 30 years. It's going to be quite quick, but I think there are some highlights that are worth mentioning. We started around about 1989 to 92 doing work in domestic IT outsourcing. It was essentially IT in those days. And we worked through, and then eventually we worked together, Mary and I, right through to 95. And you might remember her landmark books were IT Outsourcing, Myths, Metaphors, and Realities. And then in 1995 with Rudy again, Beyond the Outsourcing Bandwagon, which was essentially about doing it in-house. You know, in-house is an option. You don't have to outsource. Everyone was sort of on the outsourcing bandwagon at the time. And we found that there were quite a lot that was always kept in-house. So that was interesting. We found an enormous number of things that were interesting in that period, building up to Harvard Business Review paper in 96, I think, and Sloan Management Review papers that were all quite foundational in terms of practitioners. But I think there are four things I would say about this period of time that you might identify with. The first one was our discovery that total outsourcing was usually disappointing. Hiring one or two suppliers for 10 years or even 7 years was not getting great results. What was getting great results was a risk mitigating approach of selective sourcing, typically for 3 to 5 years with multiple suppliers. We always got asked in that period of time the stupid question, what I call the stupid question, which was how many suppliers is optimal? And we said, well, there's a stupid answer to that, and the stupid answer is 3 to 5. So we then followed the conversation from then on. But I think we did very good work, robust work on selective sourcing, which was very foundational. I think the other work we did in this period was the core capabilities work, which we did with David Feeney at Templeton College. And we developed a model of 9 core capabilities that you had to keep in-house, that were your sort of life belt to being able to outsource most things. And if you didn't have those in-house, you suffered, essentially. And that was our central finding. I thought that was highly useful to everybody, just to clarify what you could and could not outsource. So that's our first slide, a cartoon down there. It's much more subtle than you think. That is a hairdresser, and he's now outsourced the hairdressing function to concentrate on his core competence of idle chatter. Of course, for a lot of people, they go to the hairdressers not for the haircut, but for the sociability of the experience. So we were trying to suggest there that it was actually more complicated than you think. But unless you had clarity about what your core capabilities were, you couldn't really proceed to outsource. So that was, I think, an essential finding that someone somewhere had to make in the field before you could really progress the business of outsourcing. The third thing that we did was hit transaction cost economics on the head, which was not popular, to be frank, because we have a terrible habit in AIS of importing uncritically theories from elsewhere. Unfortunately, transaction cost economics is one of those things. On a memorable day at Templeton College, Mary came up to me and said, look, we tried to put all our case studies and explain it by transaction cost economics, and there is a 69% anomaly. The data didn't explain transaction cost economics, and transaction cost economics didn't explain the data. And there was a very dumb, long silence at that moment. And then we went through all the options, we'd done something wrong in coding, et cetera. And in the end, we decided that actually, no, we hadn't done anything wrong, that transaction cost economics did not explain the data, at least in IT outsourcing terms. And we then discovered when we were getting reviewed in another journal, the MISQ, which turned it down because they thought that attacking transaction cost economics wasn't a very good idea. another journal where we had two reviewers who were economists who said, well, it's notorious in transaction cost economics that, it's uncalibrated. You can get it to explain anything. Therefore, it's not that testable. It doesn't explain necessarily that much. So that was a very interesting finding for us. And from that day on, we never accepted any theory uncritically. The fourth thing we did in that period, I think, was we started producing, and this is why practice was interested in us, risk mitigation and effective practices out of our research, to the point where we did a lot of advisory work, including to governments. There was the UK Tax Department, DSS, big OS outsourcing projects. There was the Australian government. And then there was the US Congressional Committee on Internal Revenue Service that had spent $4.5 billion and was relatively unsuccessful at using IT in its department. So we were called to Washington to give evidence to a congressional committee. And I shocked Mary because I came out of the toilet before we went into the committee, and she said, "Oh my God, the top half of your suit is not the same as your bottom half. And we're going to be on TV." Anyway, fortunately, we were sitting down and it went ahead, and we got away with that one. And so that was that period of time when building up to a lot of people getting into outsourcing. I think the next thing that we started looking at, I think I wrote, well, Kuldeep Kumar and I wrote the first paper on offshore outsourcing and information systems. It was called A Passage to India, a Country Too Far, ? The story of an Atlanta-based company trying to outsource to India. That was in 96. But Mary was also hot on that trail as independently, and she did a lot of enormously good work on offshore IT outsourcing, looking at US companies to India, developed practices. I think Joe Ruttman was her main colleague in that. We did a lot of work on European companies going to India and other places. So we did a lot of work on offshore IT outsourcing. And in fact, I remember by 2006, I was spending every other month on the plane to Bangalore for about 2 years because there was so much work in terms of advisory, but also we took advantage of the research capability that we had to get a lot of data out of there. So there was offshore IT outsourcing that we definitely made an impact on. But I think the really interesting area was business process outsourcing, because by 1999, incidentally, there's the cartoon there about offshore outsourcing, which is quite funny, how they outsource Santa. These are all cartoons we used at some stage or other in our presentations. But business process outsourcing became really interesting because around about 1999, there were several startup companies that were funded by venture capitalists who were offering business process outsourcing. And of course, that was a vast area compared to IT. And Exalt was one, and they got the contract to do BP Human Resources in 99. But the really more interesting one, Exalt was a very technical company, technologically driven company. And the result was that they didn't do as well as they should have done with HR, which was not just a technology subject. The really interesting one was funded by the same venture capitalists, but it was called Exchanging, and it operated in financial services, especially Lloyd's of London insurance and British aerospace. And we got a contract from them to study them over 3 years and wrote all that up. What was great about that, I mean, this is one of the benefits of getting very close to practitioners, as many of you will know, which is that they are smart. They do know what they are doing. A number of them do. You just have to identify who they are. And Exchanging was headed up by David Andrews, who headed up the Accenture partnership. And he invented a model for business process outsourcing that Accenture just could not accept culturally. So he developed a model that basically had 7 centers of excellence within the vendor. And he staffed them with some of the best people in the world at what they were doing. The sort of areas were people, process, technology, sourcing, service, environment, and implementation. And you basically fired the necessary centers of excellence at the sourcing problem that you were facing as a vendor, but you also formed enterprise partnerships, joint ventures with the client, which was a very unusual move. Now, it wasn't that successful in the end because they couldn't get other clients to service the joint ventures, and that was the basics of the business model and making money. The point I want to make is that we sucked up all the knowledge that that company had about business process outsourcing, which greatly increased our knowledge base, as well as giving us a lot of very good academic papers, I think, but also very good practice papers. So we looked at business process outsourcing. We then started, I've sort of riding over the period of e-business when there was a lot of outsourcing attempts into the internet. One of the ones I pick up is application service provision, which was the forerunner of the big Amazon Web Services and all those giants now in the cloud sourcing business. But the forerunner was application service provision, which took off about 99. We wrote a book on it, Net Sourcing, which failed miserably because the e-bubble burst. And we ended up being sent a bill for legal services by Prentice Hall International, our publishers, of $14,000 every year for 15 years until they wrote it off as a bad debt. We were obviously not going to pay that because all these ASPs collapsed and there was all these legal issues around. It was just quite amusing in retrospect. Then we extended our offshore work into global services sourcing. I think we were foundational for helping Egypt set up an outsourcing sector, and also South Africa over a number of years. And that was really very interesting. I mean, one of the nicest things about Egypt was it was considered such an important initiative that they had dinner at the foot of the pyramids and closed it off for us in this 100+ dinner that we had. And I remember that evening I was wandered over and I said, well, I was to the guard who was on a camel with a machine gun. I said, when I was a child in 1964, we were passing this way and we were allowed to clamber up these pyramids. And he said, well, you're not allowed to now, but if you want to, go ahead. So I got about 20 meters up one of these pyramids and came back down again, reliving boyhood times. So we then studied global services sourcing. I remember writing a book with my colleagues on China services outsourcing in 2009, I think, which was very interesting indeed. It never really quite took off for various reasons, but I seem to remember Ilan and Julia doing a very good paper on outsourcing to China and overcoming the many difficulties that involved much later. So we got into global services sourcing, founding sourcing hotspots. We also got into location attractiveness studies. Then we did a lot of niche sourcing. I mentioned application service provision. There's also legal services outsourcing. That's quite interesting culturally because we got really interested in that. And there were some radical legal firms that really did use digital and outsourcing, offshore sourcing. But we found that culturally, lawyers didn't really like outsourcing very much. And they certainly didn't like information technology very much. So we did sell many copies of a book on that one, which was interesting because so many things are cultural that you don't realize when you think of in terms of economic rationality of doing things like outsourcing or keeping it in-house. Mary had a ball doing various niche sourcing practices, prison sourcing, rural sourcing, impact sourcing were the sorts of things that she called them. And then that was an interesting move. I think it was around about, we were doing all this stuff, none of this stopped. It was all happening as was in real life. But automation came on about mid 2014 when a supplier came to us called Blue Prism. And Blue Prism said, you ought to study us. We're doing some really interesting stuff. And we said, well, we'd love to, as always, find out if there's any meat in that particular sandwich. They then said, we haven't got any money. We can't pay you anything. And they were renting their boardroom, I seem to remember, in a cellar somewhere. So they were the definition of a startup, a technology startup. We went along and actually we found that indeed they were doing highly interesting stuff. And we had a lot to learn again. And this is one of the things Mary and I always loved, which is let's find some place we can learn, get more knowledgeable about this subject area. Like you lot, we're very curious. That's what makes us academics, and we like to find out things and we like to find answers. So we studied automation from about 2014, initially through Blue Prism, then through other companies. That is what some consultant, Bill Hirsch, I think, called Robotistan. It was another form of sourcing. You source it through automation. They called it robotic process automation, which was a very glamorous name from about 2012. But basically, it was software that you could configure very easily. You could learn to do it within 3 weeks, I think. And actually, when you looked at it and you saw it in action, you could automate a short cycle, simple process within about 4 or 5 weeks. To us, it was an absolute no-brainer. But a lot of technology is a no-brainer, but getting it accepted, getting people to believe in it, getting people to be capable of utilizing it and institutionalizing it and exploiting it, it's always another affair. So we always had huge mileage on helping academics and practitioners to understand the long process that involves. It's like AI now, it's pretty predictable that it's going to take a very long time before the huge promise of these technologies is going to be taken up. So we did a lot on automation. We called the software taking the robot out of the human. And we call AI and cognitive automation trying to put the human back into the robot, which was a nice way of putting it for the more simple-minded of us. But it worked. And then when the automation developed, it flowed into cognitive automation. And then that got interesting because then it was about how you join up different kinds of automation and digital technologies to develop much more powerful value creating software and processes. So we had great fun. I think we did about 4 books on that. One of the interesting things that we discovered was risk, because it was always sold as a no-brainer automation, but we eventually wrote a book of about 41 material risks that you would encounter in order to automate a process. And that's not gone away, by the way, and that's one of the problems with AI. It's not plug and play, it's not fire and forget. None of these technologies really are. And it's when people start encountering the difficulties further down the line that you get a pause and people say, do we really want to do this? Or can we scale this? Which is a big issue for a lot of organizations. So from that, what did we move on to? We were still doing automation, AI, but Mary decided she was really interested in blockchain and she was interested in it technically. I couldn't find an intellectual angle that was interesting on that. So I went down the route of AI, the artificial intelligence brain metaphor, digital transformation and the future of work. So most of my work has been on that since about 2017. You'll see the final cartoon down there is one we used, which is the employee of the month. It starts off as a human employee and then it ends up as a robot. And of course, the robots get more and more funny in the way that they look. And people actually, interestingly, we never did that psychological study, but people really got interested in identifying with the robots. They had to look physically present. They had to have names. They had to have characteristics. That was still open for grabs, I think, as an academic study, why that is the case. So that's an outline of where we have been and where the subject has been. I think more recently I've looked with Julia and Ilan at digital services, the shift to digital services, started in around about 2016, I think, and we've written several books, and we've done a 5th edition of our handbook coming up quite soon, which embraces that area. So that's a very quick thumbnail sketch of where we've been for 30 years. Career spotlights. We've given a few presentations. This is one of the smaller ones, I think. As you see, it's always invariably as a duo. So thank you for recognizing that we are a duo in many of our manifestations. We've peddled a few books, an enormous number of books. We are quite clever at getting into practitioner conferences and getting the sponsor to get a signed copy given to every participant. So that was quite rewarding at times. We've collected a few awards. Thank you for this one. Very gratefully received. That is 2001, I think. Buzz Aldrin presented that one, I think. I seem to half remember. Outsourcing World Summit, Outsourcing Achievement Award for Academic Contribution to Practice. We built a few pyramids. I know that all the trend is for writing academic papers and trying to get into the top journals. I must admit, I've always been a bit more free range than that. But I've always loved books. I've always respected books and always will. And so most of our work went into books. I think some of them are quintessential almost. I think for the IT area, global information technology outsourcing was very foundational. I always thought that 9 Keys to World-Class Business Process Outsourcing was a model of the sorts of things we stood for. And we liked all that. And we loved our books on automation, not least because we were allowed to select the covers. And as you can see, our interest in art comes through there. We've got De Chirico and Kandinsky. Yeah, we started a conference. The origins of that was, but we decided, because Julia and Ilan was with me at the time, and they're very hardworking, conscientious people. So we decided that we would have hardworking academic work and hard-working skiing work. So over 3.5 days, we managed to get an awful lot of enjoyment and sweat and tears as well into that ski conference, driven by Julia and Ilan, who made sure that we published books regularly of the papers there that were publishable. So we got a lot of academic work out of there. And I think a lot of papers went on to get published in leading journals. So that was all very, very good. Perhaps we attended far too many conferences. This is 2017, I think. Our friend, colleague on automation, John Hindle there of Vanderbilt. As you can see, we got a bit silly towards the end. That's largely it. We just want to thank, I haven't mentioned many co-authors. I stopped counting co-authors who were influential at 40. There were more than 40, a lot more than 40. So thanks and gratitude to our many wonderful co-researchers and co-authors, and the many thousands of interviewees and respondents who graciously and unstintingly gave their knowledge and time. And our thanks to you in the community who have made our journey so interesting, friendly, joyful, and rewarding. Many thanks indeed from Mary and myself. That's us in action, just to show you that Mary and I still like each other. Thank you very much indeed.